All right, so today we're actually going to go into some details, and this video is going to be going over the phases of game production. And already since the last video that I created, I've found different thoughts on the different phases of game production. Mainly, how many are there, and what exactly is defined within those phases. So we're going to jump right in and take a look at what we've got so far. Do keep in mind, as a reminder, that this is just going to be brief, descriptions, just something to kind of keep in the back of our minds. I do want to get into this in more detail further on down the road, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. So let's take a look. We are on our mirror board for game production here, and I've got the 7 different areas of game production over here on the left side. We'll go over those in a series of videos. But right now we're going to be going over the phases of video game production. I actually need to update this because I've already changed my mind and want to add another or a 4th phase. But as you can see, pre-production, production, and post-production, that's historically what has been kind of the norm. Like I said, I've stuck with 4 phases. I may change my mind in the future as I dig deeper into this. But as you can see, a phase that's kind of before the 3 normal phases is ideation. That's this one right here. And this one actually comes from, this is described by Richard, I'm probably going to butcher his name, which is terrible, Richard Lamarchand. He wrote the book A Playful Production Process. So I'll go over this book in more detail in another video. Definitely a buy for those that are interested in production. But so he called this phase kind of beforehand ideation. This phase is kind of the daydream phase. Just like the name sounds, this is the phase where ideas and research take place. And so kind of, wanting to create a game, we have an idea in our minds. We just kind of daydream about it off and on. So this will be initial thoughts on the game itself. What's the story? What are the characters? What's the setting going to be? What genre or, style are we looking at possibly doing? And again, this is just loosely speaking. This is not really mapping out a lot of the details. The research may include studying existing games of the same kind. Maybe, I don't like the word competition. That's a business term. But seeing what other creators have done or other studios have done, to kind of compare and contrast. What do you want to do? And you want to do something kind of similar, take some of the ideas that they have from there and kind of, tweak it or change it or whatever. What new technologies are out there? Maybe there is a new piece of software, an art software or a new gaming engine that you were possibly thinking about trying out for your game idea. What different art styles, maybe you had a specific art style. So I know I've mentioned it before. It's because I've just beaten the game with my family. But Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, that had a very different and unique art style. I know it's not the only game, but that's the one I most recently played. And that one and the prior one, Zelda Breath of the Wild, had an art style that I've never seen in a game before. I know they're not the only ones, though, but this could be exploring what type of art style you might want to jump into that could be different than what you've done before. Research can also include rough prototypes. This could be prototypes of game features, or it could be, maybe you have an idea of something that you haven't seen done in a game before. And so this is the time that you kind of want to see if it's even possible. This is prior to the point of commitment. Now, that's a phrase that I came up with. I call that the POC. Basically, all of these thoughts and ideas and kind of research and tinkering, these all happen before you hit a point of commitment where you are committed to doing the game. And this is important because if you have a feature that you've not seen in any games before, you want to make sure that you build a prototype and that it is possible for you to even do that. You wouldn't want to jump ahead and start creating a game and dump a bunch of resources into it, only to find 8 months down the road that it's just not possible. But the end goal of this phase is to determine whether to move forward or not, whether to pass the point of commitment. And got a little note here I wanted to mention. So the best thing that I can compare to this is kind of been my YouTube journey, this channel. And I had thoughts of this channel for probably a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, where I had ideas of what I wanted to do for this channel, but I hadn't hit a point of commitment. It was like, do I really want to do this? And there was a lot of research involved. I had to figure out how to do, work cameras, how to do lighting. As you can tell, it's still a work in progress. How to do audio, how to do color grading, all this stuff. So there was a lot of research and training involved before I was comfortable, or before I was at the point of being comfortable committing to this. And so, but that's what ideation is. And then there's pre-production. And in pre-production, this is how we define what the game is and what the resources are, or the resources that are needed in order to create the game. So around this phase is where you have schedules that are produced. There is a master schedule that is produced that becomes a key artifact. And an artifact being, a document, or it could be, I don't know, an item. In this case, it's going to be a document or a schedule. It could be a Gantt chart. Not quite sure how they display them, but we'll learn about that as we go on. But we also determine how much everything's going to cost in this phase. Normally you have what's called a work breakdown chart, or at least I'm assuming that's what they do in the gaming industry. This is kind of coming from the software development industry that I work in. So in this phase, we would have a work breakdown chart where we list the kind of the major epics, is what they're called, of the work that needs to be done. And then you begin to break those down into features and then into tasks. And then you kind of estimate, how much each of those tasks you think would take in order to complete. And then you kind of move all the way back up, and that kind of gives you a rough estimate as to how long everything's going to take to complete. Estimation is a whole nother ball game. We'll go into that in another video, but we also look at things like people requirements. How many people are you going to need? Is this going to be, there are some games that are very art heavy. And so obviously you're going to need to have a larger number of artists than probably coders. And then some games have amazing functionality, things that require a tremendous amount of coding in the back end. And so maybe you need more coders than you do artists. It depends on the game. So what people are required in order to produce this? Then you kick into things like team formations. But the ultimate goal for pre-production is to produce the technical document and the design document. I am curious to know if there are other documents that are produced here. So those of you that may have experience having gone through pre-production, whether by yourself or part of a studio, definitely put it in the comments below. I am curious to see if there are other maybe artifacts that I've left out or haven't found yet. The design document years ago, when I used to study this, I believe used to be called the Game Bible. I haven't seen that reference anywhere. That's probably an old term. Richard, the author that I mentioned earlier, he talks about a game design macro. I didn't go into it in great detail because, again, I want to revisit this later on. But this is, from what I saw, just briefly looking at it, was like kind of a lighter form of the design document. That's to help get everything pushed through into, through production. But we'll touch base. I'm definitely going to talk about his book in greater detail later on down the road because it's got amazing information in it. But then we have production. And this is where the work is actually getting done. I kind of skipped a little bit here. The technical document will go over things like what pieces of software are going to be used, what art software, what game engine is going to be used, what are I would assume it would include things like programming practices. I don't know how detailed they get into that. This is where, when it comes to the actual production phase, this is where the work is actually implemented and created. So those who write code, writing the code involved to make the game functional in accordance to the technical and design documentation. So this is where the coders start cranking out the code for the functionality. Art assets are created for the game. And this is for everything, every position. Everything is in accordance to the technical document and also the design document. And the audio team creates the sound effects, voiceovers, music composition for the game. The visual team will create, the visuals for it. And when I say visuals, I'm mainly meaning like cutscenes. You may have some, I forgot what it's called, drawing a blank. Motion capture that you need to do, things like that. But all this stuff takes place where you're creating all the different parts of the game and you're beginning to piece them together as a whole. QA teams will run tests on the prototypes if there are different prototypes out there, and then also on the game as a whole itself as it's getting put together and pieced together. There is alpha testing and beta testing. Those are very specific. We'll go into those in more detail later. And over all of this, the producers are responsible for tracking the progress. So is everything being done on time? Are there delays? Is it also staying in accordance with the budget? One of the most important things in this is for the producers to identify risks. And when I say risks, it's as if something comes up that was not foreseen, and or maybe was foreseen and now it's come to a reality. And risks being, okay, this is going to significantly delay the release of the game. Like, this is just not going to happen. I've read several postmortems, which I'll explain what that is in a little bit, where they thought a feature that was high priority was only going to take like 6 months to develop. And it actually, after 8 months and 9 months and 10 months, they finally had to can the whole thing and go back and start from scratch. And it destroys a timeline. It destroys a schedule. So that's what I mean by risks. And there's different types of risks. Again, that's another thing that I want to go over in greater detail, but not right now. But the ultimate goal for production is to, I need to word that a little bit differently, is to release, to create a version of the game that is releasable. Now, this is what I found interesting. Post-production, as we kick into that phase, that's the fourth phase. So in summary, you've got phase 1, which is ideation, phase 2, pre-production, phase 3, production, and phase 4 is post-production. This is where I got a lot of different thoughts as to what is included in post-production. So let's take a look at this. Originally in the past, again, this is many years ago, post-production was what happened after the game was released. And that was what I was taught. That was, what I read many years ago. That apparently has changed. So, Scott, one of the last video that I created, Scott made a comment and he said, I'll pull his comment up in just a minute. He pointed out that he'd recommend 5 phases actually, which is R&D, research and development, pre-production, production, shutdown, live, and post-production. The R&D sounds a lot like the ideation, so I'm going to choose to stick with that terminology. And then shutdown and then live post-production sound like what I'm calling, which this is not an official name, I'm just calling it for now. There's pre-release and then there's post-release. And from what I've gathered, I don't know why my box is rounded. Let's fix this real quick. There we go. What I mean by release is the release of the game. And so this is where things have definitely changed from back when I first started to study this many years ago. The pre-release, I guess, micro phase of post-production really focuses on final bug fixing. So at this point, the game could technically be released and it is a whole game, but it's not been polished. And so this is where you would do final bug fixing. You want to really look throughout the game and test it and look for ways that you can balance it. Balancing and equalizing the game. So this is going to be, you know, the audio. You can go through and make sure that the I forgot what they're called, but basically the audio is placed properly throughout, and you have the proper balance of sound and sound effects, and the audio levels themselves are properly balanced. But even the lighting in the game, you want to make sure that you have the lighting is balanced properly. This is where you do your color grading and just, you know, the overall polishing of the game. Now, Richard, the author of A Playful Production Process, he commented that, which I thought was really interesting. He said that the amount of time that you spend in the kind of the polishing of the game should be equal to production, actually putting the game together. And now he did comment that he's never worked on a project that did that, but I thought that was really interesting. And I actually like this, and I think this goes back to Scott's comment, which I still need to pull up here, that this really kind of makes the game go to the next level. It keeps it from becoming this giant mess of a game, keeps it from being released with, you know, some existing bugs, and it really enhances the feel, the experience, you know, the overall experience of the game. And so with that, we go ahead and pull up his comment here. Okay, Scott Foster, appreciate your feedback. This is the type of stuff that I want for the channel. Again, I'm not an expert in any of this, hence the reason why I am the Game Dev Imposter. But feedback is amazing, so I greatly appreciate that. But Scott says one thing, the 3 phases, talking about the last video that I created. I think you'll come to discover it's not 3 generally now, and 5 is probably a better number for most modern games, modern game development. And this is where he mentions the R&D, the pre-production, production, shutdown, and live post-production. And then he goes on to say, to call it pre-production, production, and post-production misses out arguably one of the most important stages, shutdown, which without it, games would be a mismatched mess of features and a lack of cohesion. And that last part, I think, goes to a lot of this like game polishing, really enhancing, like I said, the experience of the game. And so I would have to agree with that. And that actually makes me excited that, you know, the gaming industry has really picked up on this. Not that this is something that, you know, I've discovered. It's just, I agree with it, from the descriptions of what I've read. But going back to the pre-release part, there's a massive marketing push for the release of the game. And, you know, this is handled more from, you know, the marketing department, but sometimes there are, you know, maybe trailers or things that were in development specifically for the marketing. You could have artwork that's done for maybe covers of things. And, you know, depending on how big the game is, you know, you can imagine like World of Warcraft, they've got art designs on everything. You know, there's World of Warcraft cups and mugs and probably backpacks and all kinds of things. So, you know, all that's got to be prepped and ready to go for the release of the game. And then the end goal, this is where I need to take this line out of here from production. This is where the end goal of a successful release of the game is placed. So, you know, that's pre-release. And then you've got post-release. So post-release is the game has been released, hopefully successfully. And there's a number of things that can happen here. Monitor the health of the game. An example would be using analytics. So this could be like if you have an online game. I just mentioned World of Warcraft. You know, that one's been around forever. But you want to, they have to have a huge analytics department specifically for that game, because you want to know what the players are doing, how the game's performing, many metrics that you want to take a look at, just to make sure that, number one, the game is doing well, that the players are interacting appropriately and with the game and with each other. And that kind of goes into the next two, which is customer support. If there are issues, you know, you have to be able to support them. And then community engagement. This could be forums, if it's a large enough game. This could be, you know, engaging in social media, things like that. If there are questions or issues, you want to make sure that they're addressed. But lastly, you could have bug fixes or patches. So no game is released perfectly. And I know that because no piece of software is released perfectly. Maybe you need to have bug fixes for it, release some patches and things like that. But after that, and that's all more game related. Now we're going to focus inwardly on the team itself. So the next couple of things that you do, one is a post-mortem. Heather Chandler, she is the author of, here, I'll pull it up real quick. I'm going to talk about this book in greater detail later. A Game Production Toolbox. And Heather Chandler worked for Epic Games for many years and several other studios. But she calls this the learning from experience. Well, she calls, I don't want to call it a phase. I can't call everything a phase. She calls this step learning from experience, where you sit down with the team at large and you go over the things that you learned. What were the issues that you came across? What could have been handled differently? What features worked? What features didn't work? Just all of that. You want to log all these things so that as you go on to the next game as a studio, you learn from that experience. You don't repeat them. And then the last piece is the archiving of the game and its assets. So you've just produced a game, you still have all those assets. You have the models, I don't know, the meshes, you've got the technical document, you've got the design document, you've got all of this stuff that was produced as going through all these different phases of game production. And that needs to be archived and archived properly. And so Heather Chandler also has what's called a closing kit. I don't quite know what is involved with that. Again, a lot of this I want to save for another time in the future. But she's got something called a closing kit that she uses and recommends for archiving the game and its assets. So I know this was a lot of information, and even so, I didn't go into great detail with all these. That's something that I want to go do it in different times. All right, so there we go. Those are the 4 phases of game production. Again, ideation, pre-production, production, and post-production. I do reserve the right to change these. I may come back and have 5 phases or even 6. It could be something similar to what, Scott's comment. And so we'll see. This is all, living documentation. So I appreciate you. I'll see you guys in the next video.